Kamali, thank you. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up, British households and businesses are warned that the energy crisis could result in blackouts this winter. How this summer's droughts were made 20 times more likely by global warming. And President Biden visits the site of the latest natural disaster to hit the US, declaring there's no way that climate change can be denied. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. Now, National Grid has warned that in a worst-case scenario, households and businesses could experience planned 3-hour power cuts this winter if gas supplies run very low. Well, to try to avoid too much power being used at peak times, an incentive scheme is being put into place to help ease the risk of the lights going out. So customers can sign up with their electricity supplier and get money back on their bills if they shift their use of power away from times of high demand to help prevent blackouts. And larger businesses will be paid for reducing demand by shifting their times of energy use or switching to batteries or generators in peak times. The scheme will run between November and March, and it's likely to operate on at least 12 separate occasions, more if needed, to protect supplies. And there's also a warning that electricity could be cut off to households and businesses for 3-hour blocks from January if there's not enough power to keep stations going. Though, to tackle a loss of imports from the continent, 2 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants will be on standby. Well, our climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, has more detail of what's been announced.
The National Grid's winter outlook is, in the very worst-case scenario, anticipating a crisis. And so in order to prevent us from getting to that situation, it is launching the framework of a scheme that will allow consumers and businesses to sign up to a voluntary scheme via their electricity suppliers to be paid when they use electricity away from peak times. So that's charging electric vehicles overnight, charging washing machines during the day, avoiding those peak consumption periods during the morning and evening, because it is warning that in a very worst case scenario, without that scheme in place, with a very cold period of weather, with issues importing electricity from Norway and others, and potentially with a gas shortage from European counterparts and elsewhere, there could be periods of time when there are planned blackouts for UK households, potentially for up to 3-hour blocks at a time. Now, this will be a real blow for Liz Truss, who has been very reluctant to talk about individual behaviour change and reduction in consumption, and has promised there will be no rationing. Well, it's obvious that the National Grid thinks differently. And campaigners are really saying, look, the reason we're even in this situation, or we're having to worry about this worst-case scenario, is because we have failed to invest adequately in the previous decade or so in renewable energy in this country, in wind and solar power, and in energy efficiencies like home insulation schemes and so on. And had we done that, we wouldn't be reliant on fossil fuels in the same way at all. We would be insulated from geopolitical events, and we wouldn't have to be thinking about how to keep the lights on.
Well, with the emphasis on the amount of gas that will be available to fire power stations, let's take a look at our data dashboard, shall we, and see just how much of our energy supply is being produced by gas right now. And you can see that figure is 18.1% at the moment, and there's the figure for renewables, around 66% coming from renewables at the moment. Now, as households across the UK worry about affording their heating over this winter, Edinburgh Council is to improve the energy efficiency of more than 1,000 homes in the coming year after receiving £5 million of Scottish Government funding. The funding is to specifically target areas of fuel poverty and will provide wall insulation to reduce heat loss from homes, as well as renewable technologies such as solar panels and battery storage. Now, the UN Climate Summit, COP27, begins 1 month from today in the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. And at a conference in the run-up to that summit, the head of the Egyptian delegation has attacked wealthier nations for failing to honour a climate finance pledge. 13 years ago, at COP15 in Copenhagen, the richer countries agreed to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020, and that's a pledge that still hasn't been met. Now, a new study has found that the drought that much of the Northern Hemisphere suffered this summer was made 20 times more likely by climate change that's already taken place. Now, the study concluded that a drought like this summer's would have struck around once every 400 years had the world not heated up. But since human activity has increased global temperatures by around 1.2 degrees Celsius, such a drought can now be expected every 20 years. Now, the study also found that an additional 24,000 people died across Europe, in part because of this summer's heat. Well, let's get more on this from our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook. And Victoria, I guess the implication of this is that we all have to expect more droughts in the future now.
Yes, exactly. And that's really key, is just how widespread this was. So we heard this is for the whole of the Northern Hemisphere, apart from the tropical region, where drought was 20 times more likely. So we heard a lot about drought in the UK. 2/3 of EU land was in drought at one point, half of the US, big parts of China. So this is huge parts of the world altogether. And what scientists are saying is that whereas before we may have seen isolated extreme events like the hot summer of 1974, now what we're seeing is multiple simultaneous extreme events. And this happening all at the same time can only be explained by climate change, they say. Now, let's just remind ourselves of some of the impacts of this. It hit energy production. So places like Italy and Portugal struggled to produce as much hydropower as usual because there was less water. EDF struggled to cool down one of its nuclear reactors, just as the EU was struggling with limited energy supplies anyway. Likewise, it hit crop yields just as we were grappling with food security problems because of what was happening in Ukraine. So this is an example of how climate change can multiply existing threats.
Victoria, thanks very much indeed. Well, Turkey, Greece and Cyprus are still experiencing the heat wave which gripped Europe this summer, with soaring temperatures expected to continue throughout this month. Records for the hottest October day were broken in Antalya this weekend, with temperatures hitting a high of 41 degrees Celsius, the hottest October day in Turkey since 1930. Well, the unusually low water level in the lower Mississippi River is causing barges to get stuck in mud and sand, disrupting river travel for shippers, boaters and even passengers on a cruise line. Lack of rainfall in recent weeks has left the Mississippi River approaching record low levels in some areas from Missouri south through Louisiana. The US Coast Guard said at least 8 groundings of barges have been reported just in the past week. And staying with the US, President Biden has visited parts of Florida that were devastated by Hurricane Ian last week. Speaking in Fort Myers, Mr. Biden said that the series of natural disasters to have hit the US recently means that climate change can no longer be denied.
Unfortunately, I've been to a lot of disaster areas in the last couple months, last 6 months. You know, more fires have burned in the west and the southwest, burned everything right to the ground than the entire state of New Jersey, as much room as that takes up. And the reservoirs out west are down to almost zero. We're in a situation where the Colorado River looks more like a stream. There's a lot going on. And I think the one thing this has finally ended is a discussion about whether or not there's climate change and we should do something about it.
Well, NBC correspondent Shaquille Brewster was in Fort Myers when President Biden visited.
President Biden announced the opening of additional disaster recovery centers in this Fort Myers area. And I've been at one of them, the first one to open just yesterday here in Fort Myers, talking to people. And it's really a fascinating sight that you see here. We saw hours-long lines, people waiting for more than an hour to speak to a FEMA representative, many of them saying they didn't know exactly what they were going to say or what they needed from them, but they wanted some of those basic questions answered. Questions like, how do they file a claim? How long will that process process take? Many telling me that one of the first steps you need to do after a recovery, after you lost your business, after you lost the items in your home, is file that insurance claim if you have insurance. So this is a site where you also have many private insurers here with our mobile response unit. So this is intended to be a one-stop shop for people in this area. Talking with folks here as they were waiting in line, it was clear that the need here in Fort Myers and really in this entire area is so large. One of the questions that I asked them after understanding their specific situation is what would they want the president to know? What would they want the president to see on his trip? I want you to listen to some of those conversations.
Just basically everybody needs help, and you know that it's not one person or the other person, it's everybody here. We're all, citizens of the United States. And, you always see it on TV, all these places, destroyed and gone. You always think, those poor people. Now all of a sudden it's us.
President Biden's coming today. Do you think he understands the tears that he's seeing right now?
Well, if he doesn't shed a few himself, I'd be surprised. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And in this area, there are signs of progress. We know that power has been restored to the vast majority of people. The governor earlier today announcing that Pine Island, which has been closed off since Hurricane Ian made landfall, that temporary bridge has now been built well ahead of schedule. So you're seeing signs of progress in this area. But when you're talking to folks and when you're looking at the devastation still so visible, it is clear that there's a long recovery ahead for so many people. Back to you.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching.